Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast, Our New Narrative, and today is July the 8th, and today I have my guest Leo with me. We're going to watch a video of an interview of Mr. Bob Woodson, and if you don't know who he is, neither did we. But he says some very profound things in this interview that I think should be heard. I'm not asking everyone to agree with what he's saying, but just to listen to what he's saying, because oftentimes, you know, in the culture we have today in America in general, if you're not in lockstep with that choir, you get kicked out real quick. So I think this gentleman was around before the 60s era. You know, he was in the civil rights era, so he knew the Black community. You know, he knew of a certain Black community that is transformed into a different Black community. It's great to have that type of perspective. So again, before we get started, I want to ask you to like, share, and subscribe. We may end up cutting this video up into a couple of parts if it runs too long, but if not, we'll do the duration here. Let me share the screen. We get started. And here we go.
Because what you're saying to people is that you have no capacity to be agents of your own uplift. That if you're having babies out of wedlock, it's not your fault. If you're robbing and killing one, it's not your fault. If you're taking drugs, it's not your fault. That's very lethal. It's saying to people, you're almost like impotent children. You have no capacity of self-control, of self-discipline, of self-uplift. And so it undermines that capacity of self-liberation that used to characterize Black Americans, even in the presence of slavery and discrimination. None of the problems that we're witnessing over the last 50 years were in evidence when we were enslaved or during the whole period of Jim Crow de jure segregation.
The 1619 Project, published by New York Times Magazine, has been described by several Civil War scholars as historically inaccurate. But in the eyes of Bob Woodson, it was devoted the past several decades to helping people in troubled, low-income communities. Its biggest problem is that it defines America as being incurably racist. Just how does Woodson's brainchild, 1776, seek to counter this narrative? And how did the war on poverty radically transform Black communities in America? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with Bob Woodson, the founder and president of the Woodson Center. He was part of the Civil Rights Movement, and he is a recipient of the Bradley Prize and the Presidential Citizens Award. Bob Woodson, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Pleased to be here.
So Bob, 1776. I guess it's a campaign that you launched. I'm not going to say project because, of course, it's launched in response to the 1619 Project. Tell me a little, what is this about?
Well, the 1619 Project, authored by the New York Times, really, in summary, it says that America's founders were racist and they owned slaves, and therefore the Declaration of Independence that declared freedom and justice for all were invalid because the framers of that document were not worthy of the principles, and therefore the principles are invalid. And therefore America should be defined by its birth by 1619, when the first slaves arrived on the shore. And then it concludes by saying America is irredeemably racist to its core. Racism is in its DNA, and therefore the only solution is for white America to provide reparations to Black Americans. So they're saying that whites in America are inherently the victimizers, and Blacks are a class of victims. And
So I'm going to stop it here, hopefully briefly. So I've done a podcast about the inaccuracies of the 1619 Project. I don't know if I dedicated the actual podcast to the 1619, but I definitely mentioned it. me and you, Leo, did a podcast about reparations. And for now, I'm just going to talk about just the blaring inaccuracies of the 1619 projects and how dangerous that is, and how such an important subject is being basically used as a political tool, as I say more than often. But if you're going to equate America to 1619, I mean, you can't do that because America didn't come into existence until 1776. So at least get the facts straight. I mean, we're a British colony from, when John Smith landed on
the late 1400s. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So from basically pre-1776, you have to look to England, which nobody does, right? Nobody looks to England for anything. And the colonists up to 1776, and in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, there is such thing as the original draft. People, you can look that up online. And one of the blaring complaints that Thomas Jefferson wrote about was the colonists' inability to get rid of slavery due to His Majesty's negative, right? He prostituted his negative every time. So I'm quoting from that document. And so throughout, it was King James II. Before that, I think it was Queen Mary. There's document after document that shows it wasn't a constant thing like every other day. But there was, because the colonists were about individual liberty, freedom, doing things for yourself, I plant the seed, I eat the fruit, that type of mentality in the northern states, what eventually became the northern states, they felt no use for slaves, right? It was those in the southern states where you had a bunch of rich oligarchy, this rich oligarchy that had owned all this land, that were down with the crown, so to speak. They pressed and kept pressing the slavery issue, and it's there. It's documented.
Different migration patterns from Britain over to America before large migration patterns, immigration patterns from the rest of Europe started taking place, because it was a British colony after all. It's got a lot of I guess the Anglo-Saxon roots there, but there were different groups that came out of Britain that were coming to America at different points in time due to political factors that were going on in Britain. And so I think it's a travesty for us in America to not even understand British history in the context of the colonial period. It's not a good look. It looks like you're uneducated because you don't know half of your DNA. Who your daddy? You don't know who. You don't know anything about that. And it's like they just pick up the conversation and they talk about America, going.
I guess we're gonna have to switch to 5G. You froze up. You're freezing or froze up. Yeah, you're. There you go. Are you back?
Yep, I'm back. I didn't know I dropped.
Yeah, we missed all that.
Well, I guess I was saying about the immigration patterns again.
Well, we got that. Then you said you got to know who your daddy is, and we don't know. Yeah. Education is bad. And while you're there, I'm just going to piggyback on that real quick because it is important. So from 1619, if we want to give it a date, you had 4 distinct cultures that migrated to America. And I've mentioned it before in other podcasts, but they're the Quakers, the Puritans, the Cavaliers, and the Rednecks. Now, they were called Rednecks and Crackers in England. So I'm not insulting anybody. It's just an identifier. And they were very distinct cultures. They may have all been Caucasian, but that's almost like saying a Russian and a French person are the same.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's not.
They were totally different cultures, different values, and the values that were unique to the world came out of the Quakers and Puritans. What was old was the Cavaliers, who were basically, you know, royalists. They were attached to the monarchy. They believed in that
Had a certain, had a, I guess, perspective about work versus non-work.
And then you had what's called the rednecks. And unfortunately for Black folks, the 90% of Black people in America during the slavery times, our culture, we basically absorbed the Cavalier and redneck culture, which...
And it's like so difficult to say that to a Black person. Like, you know you're a redneck when, well, you're pouring black. Take off Foxworthy's joke. You know you're a redneck, pouring black. You got the same culture they got, bro. You like, huh? You tell somebody that's Black, man, they'll start a riot.
Yeah. And the Caucasian people who grew up or who came from that culture, if they stayed in that culture, they are not, they haven't proven to be successful. Those who've given up that culture and moved out of that culture or put away those values, they've moved on to be successful. And it's just the values that they've picked up were the values of the Quakers, mainly the Quakers and Puritans, with this egalitarian mindset, this individual freedom, individual liberty, the right to worship who and what you wanted to. That was unique to the world. Slavery was as old as 9,000 years of slavery before any Caucasian or African stepped foot on American soil. So just from this 2 minutes, I just debunked all the 1619, the whole project. But they are implementing this stuff in school. So you're gonna have kids growing up just thinking, well, my teacher, Miss Johnson, said that whites are all victimizers and I'm a victim. What do you think?
Or at least not even saying that, but the I guess the implication, implying it is more vicious, I guess, like he said, you know, a strong word, lethal, than just flat out saying it. They're through the whole teaching pedagogy that is the case, and we're saying that's not the case. You just learn some bad values and you need to try and unlearn them, I guess.
Yeah. So one, if you're gonna teach something, teach the fact.
Right.
Don't just teach stuff that goes with your politicized narrative. You know, because you're gonna have all these kids growing up with this narrative in their head that as long as they're Black and living in America, you got some white person out there who's trying to screw them over.
Yeah, well, and we know that's not the entire case.
Right. So let them keep going.
And it offers no solutions at all to the problem. They're saying that America is defined by race and just leaves it there. So 1776, we are challenging it by saying, no, America cannot be defined by its birth defect of slavery. None of us should be defined by what we used to be in our past. That America is defined not only by its problem, i.e. slavery and discrimination, but also the promise of freedom and justice for all. And our Constitution is a document that allows for self-correction. And we are the only nation to ever have an Emancipation Proclamation to end slavery. The only nation in the world.
Bob, you know?
And I gotta give, you know, America its due. Now, when I was like 18, 19, you know, I was like, screw the man, F America, you know, basically a junior Marxist. But hey, man, 9,000 years, this institution called slavery was prevalent. It wasn't nothing wrong with it. Nobody cared about it. Like, you got to think about this. The first organized group to say we are opposed to slavery. Happened
America.
like 1732, and they ain't even get, that was over in England, they ain't even get traction here in America until 1776. With
So
Ben
soon we're Americans, but it had roots in Britain.
Yeah. Ben Franklin was the president of America's first abolitionist society, which started in, ironically or coincidentally, 1776. So people today act like slavery was this horror, like people couldn't, no one would ever dream of, only evil people would enslave people. Look, if you had money, you had slaves. That was regardless of color.
Right.
That's why you had black slave owners in America. That's why you had white slave owners in America. That's why you didn't have poor slave owners in America.
It was an economic concept, I
Yep.
guess.
And it was, and it's, I'm not dismissing like the trials and tribulations of those who were enslaved, but you can't look at slavery
As unique in America.
1600s as if, you know, you had these white men. Like I said, you can't look at slavery as if white men was rolling up to the drive-through in Starbucks, snatching people out the window and putting them on a cotton plantation.
That's a funny visual that you just put out there. Because I'm picturing this. It's not.
Which is crazy because you still have people in slavery today.
Yeah.
And
we don't talk about
our community don't give up about it.
Nobody talks about it.
Nobody talks about it. We talk about reparations, though. We want money for something that didn't happen to us, but won't lift a finger to help our brothers and sisters of African descent, Indian descent, East Indian descent,
Right.
Persian descent. No one
Get snatched up by somebody, and it's still happening today, and it's just like we don't talk about it. That's crazy.
And and I'll let them finish here, but one thing that needs to be talked about is white Christian slavery. No one ever talks about it, ever. And that's a part of that old narrative. See, you can't be white and be a victim. You can only be a victim if you're black. But you have millions of whites enslaved, white Christian slavery. Just Google it. Hopefully it'll come up. Hopefully. I had to go read books that was written in the 1800s to find out anything about it, and it was going on for centuries. All right, here we go.
This actually reminds me of something you said at the opening, some days back, the launch of 1776. I think you had said something to the tune of, nothing is more lethal, and I remember that word lethal, than giving people a good excuse to fail. I thought that was very interesting. This was part of your opening speech, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about now. Can you expand on this a bit?
I mean, Black Americans, particularly low-income Black Americans, are faced with an internal crisis. We have more Blacks killing Blacks in 1 year than were lynched in the whole period of 60 years under slavery.
I believe you meant to say Jim Crow. And if you go back and read the statistics on Blacks who were lynched from the Reconstruction era through Jim Crow up until the Civil Rights era, I think at most it was like 300 and something. Like the high was like 300 in a year, like 300 and something. Growing up in Detroit, you have at least we were clocking like 350 a year in the murder rate. Now it's back when I was a kid, when Detroit was the murder capital of the world. So again, if it's a white person killing us, it's a problem. If it's a Black person killing a Black person, whatever.
Suddenly silent, yeah.
We have a 9/11 every 6 months, 3,000. We have 70% of the babies that are born out of wedlock. But that's an internal problem. And for 1619 to say that problem is caused by the the shadow of slavery and discrimination is patently untrue and lethal, because what you're saying to people is that you have no capacity to be agents of your own uplift. That if you're having babies out of wedlock, it's not your fault. If you're robbing and killing one, it's not your fault. If you're taking drugs, it's not your fault. That's very lethal. It's saying to people, you're almost like impotent children. You have no capacity of self-control, of self-discipline, of self-uplift. And so it undermines that capacity of self-liberation that used to characterize Black Americans, even in the presence of slavery and discrimination. None of the problems that we're witnessing over the last 50 years were in evidence when we were enslaved or during the whole period of Jim Crow de jure segregation. And in fact, as I've said here, when white people were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. And so what we did through these series of essays is carefully refute this notion that the conditions that many Black Americans are facing today is related to that legacy of slavery. That is patently a lie. It's not true. It is a false narrative. So what we are doing is presenting evidence that it's false. One study, for instance, that I cite in my essay is that between 1920 and 1940, the education gap between Blacks and whites in the South was 3 years. Whites had an 8th grade education, Blacks at 5th grade.
At the same age.
The same time. But Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, partnered with Booker T. Washington, and together they built 5,000 what they call Rosenwald schools. Rosenwald put up part of the money. The other came from Black Americans who sold dinners, and they had a little route, and they put up $4.6 million to build these schools. And as a consequence, in just 20 years, between 1920 and 1940, the education gap closed within 6 months.
Now, if we were taught to read, or if America was taught to read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, that would be common knowledge. But no, we just get to hear about Booker T. Washington during Black Victimization Month and in a snippet, right? Not only did the Rosenthal schools come into existence, and the value, you gotta look at the Black community and what values they had. Like, they were right out of the Civil War, basically, Reconstruction. And you gotta think, all right, you got 90% of the Black population as former slaves. No idea what freedom meant, period. And I always say this, if you read Gone with the Wind, they don't portray this in the movie, but in the book, Mammy, she's always talking about, I don't want nothing to do with this freedom. I don't know nothing about no freedom. These free Negroes, right? These free, she used to call them the free movement Negroes or something. Now, she wasn't disparaging freedom. She was presenting a real concern, like for generations, from 1619. If you were a slave, you were totally dependent on your master. Your movements were totally defined by the rule of law. You had no independence. So all of a sudden you got to be thrown into freedom, right? And a lot of people didn't, whoa. So what the union, what was it called? The union agency? No, the union, it's either the union group, the union agency, something like that. They went into the South after the Civil War and started teaching attributes of individual freedom, responsibility, capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, not only to the newly emancipated slaves, but to the poor whites as well, who also didn't know nothing about, capitalism. They were.
We're just not taught. There's no real education. It's just indoctrination.
Exactly. And that's purposeful. In my opinion, that is purposeful.
Yeah, political means to ends, I guess, that never end, right? I mean, it never ends.
All right, let me. I got forgot my train of thought, but anyway, let him. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything. Hopefully, I wasn't trying to draw a conclusion, but yeah, let him keep going.
Same with the marriage rate in the Depression between 1930 and 1940, when our economy went broke. The unemployment rate among whites was 25%. It was 40% for the Black community. But the Black community during that time, when there was the jury segregation, the economy was failing, our marriage rate was higher than any other group in society. Elderly people could walk freely in those neighborhoods without fear of being mugged by their grandchildren. And so there is other evidence. And when Blacks were denied access to hotels, we built our own hotels. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles in Chicago. I could go on and on and on. When we were denied access to banks, we built our own banks, medical schools, dental schools. And so we had a rich tradition. In Chicago, as you know, is characterized by violence. In 1929, there were 731 Black-owned businesses in the city, Chicago's Black neighborhoods. There were $100 million in real estate assets in 1929. And so the point of this is this: if Blacks achieved this level of self-sufficiency and independence because of the strong moral code of conduct that was based upon our Christian faith, and also the whole virtues of our founders of thrift, of being responsible. There were several Blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires.
So I'm gonna stop here, and a lot of times, you know, people on the right, here's my beef, so to speak, with people on the right. Fortunately or unfortunately, they tend to lean to throw in religion. And I think it clouds, it kind of murkies the water a bit. Yes, religion is important to some people, and that's fine. But in my opinion, the slave who went from, you know, slavery to being dying a millionaire, it was more about the capitalist values and attributes that they took on and started to practice in their life that led them to being a millionaire. Because, you know, our community, everybody was born and raised, everybody was born under, in, around the church. But it wasn't religion. If that was the attribute to get you to become a millionaire, all Blacks would be millionaires, right?
Yeah.
That's not the case. But he presents some very interesting facts that you can't refute. And I hope people really listen to him and others like him. I'm gonna throw out some names: Thomas Sowell, who else? Mr. Steele, Shelby Steele, who else? William, I can't think of his name. It'll come to me later. But they're just, it's always facts. There's always facts. And the facts are on our favor as a community, that we have done some great things as a community, a part of a bigger community, the American community. But I'm gonna let them keep going.
Because of the free enterprise system that 1619 says is racist. And so all of the problems that we're witnessing today did not happen until the 60s. Up until the 1960s, prior to that, poverty that was never associated with social dysfunction. Being poor didn't mean that you had to steal.
I gotta stop here, Leo, because this, you're gonna relate to this. So when me and you were in Japan together, but I went back to teach English, and I lived in what the Japanese call a danchi, which is basically their version of the projects, right? Cheap,
Right. Yeah.
cheap governmental housing. Never locked my door.
Yeah.
I'm surrounded by broke Japanese people. Poor.
Meanwhile, it's a mansion somewhere built in the neighborhood around the corner, right? It wasn't set up like that, even economically. So, yeah.
So what he's saying is true. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to rob, steal, and kill, right? And he's saying back when he was growing up, you had a lot of poor black people, but you felt safe in those black neighborhoods. That started to change after the 60s.
Yeah, yeah. For political reasons. I mean, expediency, I guess. Those social, welfare programs and, things that were set up around that era. They really did anything but benefit a political group, I guess, and so to speak. And it's not even socioeconomics. It's more like economic socialism kind of thing. We mispronounce it. It's economic socialism. It's not socioeconomics, because the values ended up being tied to economic things that we don't even know. You'll say this to someone like racism is related to economics. They'll look at you like you speaking an upside down backwards foreign language, but it really is. It's either related to something political or something economic, that those values ended up getting defined later on, and it's about some money, because you think of slavery in terms of socio-economic, but it's like, you weren't a slave because you were black. You just happened to be a slave because your people got their butts whooped in a war probably and got sold into that thing, and that's what happened. And you, I guess, in our system, you're taught, what I guess the speaker is saying, we're taught the black thing first, and it's really maybe the money thing, the war thing that happened to enslaved people. It wasn't because you happened to be black and inferior that you were enslaved. It was some war situation, something that went on that caused that enslavement, and it wasn't just because you were a certain skin color.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say something. I repeated. I don't know. I might have said it to you, but I don't think you had the reaction I'm talking about. I said it to somebody. I said, "No, it wasn't you. I know exactly who it was." I said,
"You would have known if it was me." Cause like the bro don't lie. You got an afro for a reason.
He said, "I'm quoting Mr. Dr. Thomas Sowell." He said, "Black people weren't slaves because they were black. They were slaves because they were available." And man, somebody got triggered, right? But basically what it meant was, like you said, you have Africans born with Africans, you lose, you're enslaved, you got sold to some Caucasian Europeans over to America. Them Caucasians ain't driving. There was no slavery drive-through.
I love that analogy, like a Starbucks, just white dude just going up to a drive-through. That's some Dave Chappelle level stuff right there. Yeah, I'll take two buck Negroes and 3 Nammies. Give me, they wasn't just driving up to a drive-through taking mugs, man.
Yeah, I mean, in a way they were, because they had factories set up, but they were set up so that the Africans could go into the interior, get the slaves, bring them back to the factory where our ancestors were sold to Europeans. But they were in slavery before any European ever saw them.
Right.
But we never talk about that. We never talk about reparations from the Africans who sold us into slavery. Although
Johnson is talking about reparations, as wealthy as he is and accomplished. I'm like, why you get out of here with that? Reparations? No, man.
But coincidentally, I think it's the country of Maui, not Maui. How do you pronounce that? Is
it Maui? M-A-L? Mali? Yeah.
They actually apologized, a written apology to their former, I guess, citizens who they sold off into slavery.
Wow. Never hear that though, unless you're on this podcast.
Yeah, you ain't gonna hear nothing about that. So if you're gonna talk the truth, let it be the whole truth.
Whole truth, not part of it. Thank you. That's right. Let it be the whole truth. That's a tagline for the show, right? Let it be the whole truth. Don't just tell part of it. Wow. Because, I mean, even in our experience after learning foreign languages, the word slave comes from Indo-European, Slav. It's from over there. That word isn't even, it tells you where it came from. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Which,
and we don't talk about even that. So.
Yeah, which leads to, white Christian slavery and all that stuff. I mean, Slavs, slaves, not disparaging them. It's just history.
They were warring up there, and that ended up being a social situation that the people got put into. I mean, they were fighting, and people got, usually in any war, you got enslaved if you lost. I mean, they took control of those populations that lost in the war. So,
but these politicians, for their benefit and our detriment, turned slavery, the institution, into some personal thing.
Yep.
Only black folks were ever enslaved. Only white people own slaves. The truth is, a very small percentage.
You are owed reparations, and it's not true. So,
like we said, only a small percentage of white people in the Confederate States actually own slaves. 11% of all Americans at the height of slavery, only 11% own slaves.
We even misunderstand West Virginia, right? I mean, people think that it's the most racist state, and it's like, no, they actually were probably the least racist state at the time, because that's how Virginia became West Virginia. And you think in your mind that they, what you're taught or what's inferred is that they were these really messed up group of people that live in that state, and it was like not the case at all, because they probably were the least racist. They were the most individualist people in America, even at the time. Because like you told me, I was like, okay, West Virginia was the only state that developed during the Civil War. I was like, wow, didn't know that. They didn't teach me that yesterday. You know what I'm saying? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, they basically were, that part of Virginia was, the western part of Virginia was all yeomen. They didn't have a necessity for slaves. So they were like, what the hell? We gonna fight a war over slavery for, we don't need them. Now, I'm not gonna say that they didn't have their prejudices, because look, man, let's be real. Back in the day, 200, 300 years ago, whatever rumors were spreading about black folks amongst white folks, that the version of Twitter back in the day, probably wasn't that great, right? So it's because the narrative concerning blacks was controlled by the slave owners. They owned all the government, all of the press. So they ain't anything that presented blacks in a favorable light, they got rid of that shit, because that was messing with their money. Did you freeze up again? Yep. You're over there looking like a statue. You froze up again. Now I can't hear you.
We broke up a little.
There you go. All right. Yeah, but I think I got recorded. But anyway, let's get back to this guy. Not this guy, but
Bob Woodson.
Yeah. Let's we're only 10 minutes into this thing.
Wow, it feels like 20, right? I mean, he said so much.
We had 35 minutes. I'm gonna break this up in a minute. Let me let him go another probably couple of minutes. Then we'll part two.
Being poor meant you were broke, but you still had values of personal responsibility, of resilience. And so what we are doing in 1776 is we want to go back and document through our research and also how blacks were able to achieve resilience and self-sufficiency. What were the strategies of it? There's a fascinating and also Grace in Action. For instance, Robert Smalls was a man who was born 1836 in Sumter, South Carolina, and he was a slave, and he worked on a supply ship for the Confederacy. Well, he stole the ship, picked up his family members, and founded a...
Now, I heard a very educated man, black man, tell me that there were no black Confederates.
Really?
Yes, and that just shows our education system, because Robert Small, I knew of him, I read of him recently. Now, I ain't gonna say he was a household name in my house, but I read, his story is amazing, amazing. He's gonna tell a little bit of it. But the fact that we know more about lynching than Robert Small should tell you something.
Right, right. You know, you being kind of...
The master and made the hand signals and got through all the Confederate batteries and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. President Lincoln and the Congress gave him $1,500, which was a lot of money then. But also it convinced Lincoln to allow blacks to fight in the war, Civil War. Robert Smalls became, after the war, became wealthy. He became a politician during Reconstruction, served in the Congress, actually went back and purchased the plantation on which he was a slave and took in the children of the slave master who were destitute at the time. So I just think...
Now I'm about to go on a little rant here probably, but like I said, if you showed me a cotton field, I probably wouldn't know what I'm looking at. This dude was not only a slave, he went back and rescued the children of his slave owner. Now, you might want to say whatever you want to say, but what I'm saying is, and me and Leo have talked about this, and I'll present this information at some point in the future. There was a time, white supremacy was born out of the necessity to protect the institution of slavery. Racism was born, not to say it didn't exist, but in its, I guess, active sense, in its most visceral sense, in what we see it as today. That didn't come about until after or during Reconstruction, because there are more than just Robert Smalls with stories where black people who were slaves were still friendly with their ex-owners. So where's the hatred at? Like, when did this come about? And that just goes to show how slavery as an institution wasn't personalized. It was, hey man, I'm not dismissing the woes of slavery, and it wasn't a good deal at all, right? But if the example of the small tobacco farm, right, who happened to own a slave, if you working side by side with this slave, you a brave MF if you out there whipping him every day and raping his wife.
Right, you ain't trying to kill him.
You gotta go to sleep. You gotta go to sleep. How you gonna go to sleep knowing that you jacking this dude up every night and raping his wife every night? But that's the image, that's the narrative that's just been pushed on us since the 60s. And if you go back in history, not to say that it was all kumbaya, yes, there were black folks who wanted to kill their former masters, but that wasn't...
Hell, my landlord. Ed Murphy that people would be lost on if you want the 70s, 80s, baby. Mr. Robinson's.
Oh yeah. Yeah, but the point I'm making is, again, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, not the half truth. Where you have historical figures, if you go back and read about them during the time, not somebody who wrote it 8 generations later, but a lot of these people have autobiographies. You can read it from the horse's mouth.
And they don't teach that. Protested for trying to put their book on the book list. They tried, the way schools are now.
Yeah, if you can't read Huckleberry Finn, you ain't reading books
Wrong.
in Washington either. So, but
Right.
yeah, I'm gonna end it. I'm gonna end this one with this, and I should say this every time I open my mouth. The President Andrew Johnson, the leader of the Democratic Party, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated, him and Montgomery Blair.
Like, I could almost lip sync you on this one.
They said the key to politics is no longer slavery. It is race.
Right.
You were pro-slavery before the war, too bad. If you're anti-slavery after the war, too bad. There's no more slavery. So how does a political party who basically ran on slavery, keep slavery alive, keep hope alive, keep slavery alive, right?
Race Part 2, 2.0. Got to come up with something.
Yep, you got to come up with something. And they came up with race. They made everything about race. That birthed Jim Crow laws. That birthed lynching, right? And from there you go from Jim Crow laws up to, and it just get worse and worse. And then they couldn't get votes by stringing up brothers, right? So they let that go. It's turned into socialists. If we gonna you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, vote for me, you get a car, you get a chicken.
Pre-Oprah. Pre-Oprah show.
Right? So vote for me, we gonna give you something. And that's the Great Society to the welfare state in the 60s. And what that did was destroy the African-American family. And now they're utilizing the African-Americans as basically a Trojan horse to just keep pushing in these socialist policies, values and policies to get votes. And so I'm gonna leave that.
Like Newsweek trying to invade your market here, Dre. They came up and said Black Lives Matter don't care about. I gotta say it in the Snoop Dogg voice. Right. Black Lives Matter don't care about Black lives, baby. I was like, what? Did they actually print that in Newsweek? And that's the truth.
Hey, did I tell you?
Founders going, I'm a trained Marxist. I'm like, black people read that. Y'all being forced to be Marxist, and you don't even know it. You ain't even being a good American because you trying to believe some Russian crap that never worked.
Dude,
it never will.
Dude, at this point, when you say Marxist, it ain't about being an American. It's about being alive. Because they done killed more people than probably anything. I mean, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. I mean, that body count is Pol Pot, various African nations, various South American nations. They are responsible for more deaths than, I don't know, man. I can't even name. Yeah. I mean, what's more, seriously, like what has killed more people than Marxism/communism?
Not even the bubonic plague, I think, killed that many people. It's been a political system that killed more people than disease.
Yeah, man. So we gonna stop it here. Hey, if you stuck around this long, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll be back soon. Now, to do that, I got to end this thing. So
okay.